In an age of so many truth claims, is it even rational to believe in Christianity? Like, is it something that we should believe? Like, does it make sense? In this video, I want to provide 3 reasons why I think Christianity makes sense and why you should be a Christian. So often I feel like I hear that there are really good arguments against Christianity. Online, you hear this all the time, like, oh, this is the argument against Christianity, or this just crushed Christianity. Alex O'Connor destroys all Christians, right? And you see that, or science buries God, and all these different statements about why there's these great arguments against Christianity. And oftentimes you'll even hear Christians make the comment, yeah, that's a good argument. Just from purely logical argument type standpoint, they'll say things like the hiddenness of God argument is a logically consistent and logically good argument from an argument standpoint. Now, here's why I disagree with the argument and its conclusions, but it is a good argument from an argument's case. And now, the opposite is not true. I feel like I rarely ever actually see non-Christians going, hey, there are really good reasons to be a Christian. And I think that the reason that is probably because so many non-Christians are interacting with caricatures of the Christian faith, right? They're interacting with people who say things like, well, I'm a Christian because I have had an experience. And most of the time when they ask that question, hey, why are you a Christian? Help me understand why you're a Christian. People don't really give them any other reason other than, hey, I've had an experience. Now, I'm not going to dog on experiences. I think experiences are incredibly important. Your personal experience with Jesus is maybe the most important, significant thing regarding your faith in Jesus, right? In fact, I have 3 reasons why you should be a Christian, but the number one reason why I'm a Christian in some sense is because I've had a real experience with Jesus. But that argument doesn't really hold up when I'm interacting with someone who's not a Christian. Why? Because lots of people have experiences. Muslims have experiences. Hindus have experiences. Mormons have experiences. I mean, if we're being honest, like the entirety of Mormon theology is based off of an idea of an experience. Read the Book of Mormon. Ask God if it's true. And if you have a burning in your bosom, you'll know it's true. Like that's most testimonies from Mormon elders. And so missionaries, right? And so experience is not the best argument to have whenever you're interacting with someone. Now, of course, we can say, well, here's my experience of knowing Christ. I had this moment where I didn't know Christ. This is what my life looked like before. This is what my life looked like after. And when we share a testimony, we're inviting people into the reality of what experiencing Jesus has done, what it's accomplished, how it's changed us. And so that's relevant. It does point to something tangible, especially for people who know us, but it can't be the only reason that we're a Christian. It can't be the only reason we're giving other people as to why they should be a Christian. Now, I'm not going to give us like these depthy theological ideas of like, you should be a Christian because God created the world and he wants to know you. He sent his one and only son to die for you because your sins deserve punishment. Jesus died for you and the punishment that you deserve, right? Like those are theological reasons as to why you should be a Christian. I think that they matter, but I more so want to just provide what I think are 3 pretty good reasons to be a Christian in the sense of I think they answer some of the big questions and invite people into like think somewhat seriously about Christianity. That Christianity is not just this comically driven faith where it's blind, but that Christianity actually is a faith that is seeking to provide real answers to the questions of life and is rooted in history, and that matters. So what's the first reason I have for being a Christian? Well, it's very similar to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, right? As Paul talks about the resurrection and the significance of the resurrection. If the resurrection of Jesus didn't happen, if the future resurrection isn't going to happen, all of this is pointless. So the resurrection is central to Christianity. And with that, I think, is the historicity of the resurrection and the Christian faith. So, my first reason, really, for why I think you should be a Christian and why Christianity is ultimately rational, I think, is because it's historical. There's history of the testimony of history is really profound in some sense when we think about the Christian faith. When we look at history and we're just studying history to understand what happened in the first century in Judea, we can learn lots of things. We know that in the first century there was a man named Jesus who was performing miracles, and that comes from Josephus's testimony. That comes from the Talmud, which is not a Christian writing. It identifies that Jesus was a sorcerer, and even the Gospels acknowledge that the Pharisees were aware that Jesus was doing miracles. And the challenge was, under whose authority was Jesus doing these miracles? Was it Satan's or was it God's, as Jesus was claiming? And if it was God's, then he was who he said he was. He was the Son of God, in fact. And so we have right there this kind of baseline historical claim. There was a man named Jesus who did miracles in the first century. That right there in and of itself is a really big a point for us as Christians, that we can go, look, we at least have this thing here. We also know that outside of Jesus having been a real person who was performing miracles, we also know that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He really was crucified. And then we have this. Jesus' body was missing after his death and his burial, which is an odd thing to happen. Either the disciples stole it, which I'll talk about why I think that's an odd claim to make, or he actually rose from the grave, which was something that he said would happen, that after 3 days his body would be raised, which is what I think happened, especially given the testimony of what happens after the supposed resurrection, right? We have supposedly 500 people having seen the resurrected Lord. That's significant. But we also have the conversion of Paul, who was a persecutor of Christians. We also have the conversion of James, Jesus' skeptical brother. James wasn't a follower of Jesus. He was skeptical about Jesus. That's a big deal, right? Because it's pointing out to us like, oh, we have these two individuals who were not pro-Jesus all of a sudden being on Jesus's team. So something obviously happened. And what could that have been? Well, if you say you're going to die and be raised from the grave, and that's going to be testament of who you are, that's probably what happened. Jesus really did rise from the grave. Coupled with these two unlikely converts, James and Paul, as a result of the resurrection, I think is the testimony of what happens to the disciples, right? So, one of the claims is that the disciples stole the body. That claim doesn't hold up whenever you think about what happens to the disciples. Because if the disciples just stole the body, why did they endure what they endured? You would think at least one of them would have broke and said, look, we didn't do this. It didn't happen. You're right. Jesus didn't rise from the grave. We stole the body. But instead what we see is that the disciples go to the ends of the earth and they proclaim the resurrection of Christ, and that all who have faith in him will be saved. It's a peculiar reality. I think the testimony of the apostles that get sent out from Jerusalem is a really important point to look at when it comes to the historicity of the gospel narrative and the historicity of the resurrection. It points to the fact that something happened in the first century, that the resurrection really did occur. And I think that's the only logical conclusion we should have with the data that we actually have. Just to name off what actually happens to these disciples. Peter's crucified upside down under Nero's reign. James, the son of Zebedee, not Jesus' brother, is beheaded in Jerusalem by Herod Agrippa. Andrew, he took the gospel to southern Russia, and he dies in Greece afterwards. Philip is beaten to death in Hierapolis, which is in modern-day Turkey. A Roman proconsul came to faith under his preaching, and he was arrested. And then we have Bartholomew, who was flayed while he was alive and then beheaded. We have Matthew, who was speared to death. Thomas, who was beaten to death and then speared to death in India. James, who was stoned to death in Jerusalem. Thaddeus, who was axed to death in Syria. Simon the Zealot, who was sawn in half in Persia. And then we have John, the beloved disciple, who did not die a martyr's death, but who did face exile after being having burning oil poured on him, or he was dipped in burning oil one way or the other, and he obviously endured some major persecution. All of that is an odd thing to endure if you stole the body, which is why I think it's a good thing. It's reasonable for us to conclude that he actually did rise from the grave, that Jesus actually did rise from the grave, and they were just claiming historical facts. And so my first reason why you should be a Christian, why Christianity makes sense, and why it's rational, is because it's historical. There's the tradition of history behind the Christian faith. My second reason is that because Christianity provides a moral framework for the world that we live in. Within Christianity, you don't just have a deity saying what is good, but you have him actually embodying it. God himself is goodness. And in the person of Jesus Christ, he becomes man and he lives out what is good. And he shows us all of what it actually means to be good. It's also helpful for us to understand that without Christianity, there is no framework for morality. There is no objective framework for it. You can just live however you want. You can do whatever you want. You can call evil good. You can call good evil. And there's no one who can say anything else, anything but the opposite, right? It is what you want it to be. And that's kind of the significance of Christianity. The Christian faith comes in and God says, no, there is an objective goodness. There is an objective evil. We must point that out. Christianity provides an answer to what is good and what is evil. I love in the opening of Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis points out that we all understand that there is some level of objectivity when it comes to good versus evil. He talks in the opening chapter about how we often quarrel about things. And in our quarreling, we're identifying that we believe that there is something that is right and that there is something that is wrong, which I think is such an important thing for us to note here. Because if we don't have a Christian worldview, if we don't have Christianity at all, there is no right and there is no wrong. There is what I want and there is what you want. And that is what it is. And so we need to emphasize, if you're a Christian, we need to emphasize that Christianity brings a moral framework for all of life. And so my second reason, really, for Christianity and why you should be a Christian is because Christianity provides a moral framework that actually makes sense, that actually identifies what is evil and identifies what is good. Whereas atheism, and I think even other religions, both bring up all of that as kind of a flimsy, well, maybe it's evil, but maybe it's good, depending on the scenario. Whether that's atheism or Islam or whatever other religion you want to insert, I don't think they actually bring about a standard for objective morality the way Christianity does. And I could go into that with other religions as to why. We even see within Islam times where God does evil things, or Allah does evil things, and Muhammad does evil things, but God says they are good. That's not the case in the scriptures. We never see that actually being the case and occurring in the scriptures. There is always an objectivity to what is good and an objectivity to what is evil. We must point out that the Christian worldview provides that. Nothing else does. My last reason, Christianity makes sense of the world that we live in. There's no other purview that I can see the world through that helps me understand the world that we live in. If we think about the world, we know that it had a beginning. The universe had a beginning. We all agree that the world is in shambles. There's war, there's famine, there's earthquakes, there's natural disasters, all those things. The world we live in today is in shambles. We all long for redemption and some level of reconciliation. and we all long to have hope in something. Like those are natural inclinations for us as humans. And so I think Christianity makes sense of all of that, right? Because really within all of that is this idea, this paradigm of creation, fall, redemption, glory. That's the Christian meta narrative. That's the biblical meta narrative that we see. You know, the Bible says there was a beginning to the universe. The Bible explains why the world is in shambles. There was a real fall. It actually makes sense that the reason the world is the way it is because there is sin. Evil just isn't this arbitrary thing out there or force out there. Evil is a direct result. Both natural disasters and real evil that happens to you is a direct result of sin. And then we also have reconciliation and redemption. God himself has come to redeem us. And he won't just redeem you and I. He's going to reconcile all of creation unto himself. There will be a new heaven and a new earth. And all those who have faith in him will have everlasting life. That right there is then what leads to the hope of future glory, the glory that we will have in the new heaven and new earth. And so there's no other framework in the world that provides that. There's no reason that you should be an atheist and have hope for what the tomorrow will bring, or what 100 years will bring, or 500 years will bring. The biblical narrative, the scriptures themselves, Christianity makes sense of the human experience that says the world is in shambles. I long for something more. There has to be more to this. It makes sense. I think about what Peter says in John chapter 6. He says to Jesus, after Jesus is like, why are you all still here? And Peter says, where else would we go, Jesus? You know, I don't know where else I would go as a Christian. I've studied other religions. I've done the atheism thing. I've seen where all of those things lead, and I don't think they make sense of the world that we live in the way Christianity does. Christianity makes sense of the world that we live in. Does that mean I have all of the answers? Not at all. But it makes the most sense of the world that we live in. It makes the most sense about life and purpose and destiny. It makes the most sense about morality. It makes the most sense about love. It makes the most sense about beauty and why we're attracted to beautiful things. I think that as Christians, we often forget that Christianity is the worldview that we're viewing things through, and so we neglect the fact that it makes sense of the things that we're and how we experience them, especially as Westerners. But Christianity legitimately makes sense of the world that we live in. We have to remember that. And so these are my three reasons why I think Christianity makes sense and why you should be a Christian. These are just some of my personal favorites as I think about it. More than just, hey, I've had an experience. I think the experience matters. You know, your personal experience with Jesus is probably going to be the reason at the end of the day that you remain a Christian in encouraging your soul. God's the reason you're going to remain a Christian. He will hold you fast. But the thing that will encourage you is looking back on remembering what God has done. But I think these things also help us to run the race and to be faithful. We remember the Christian faith. We remember that it's historical. We remember the morality that is brought about because of the Christian faith. And we remember that Christianity makes sense of the world that we live in. These things are really helpful, I think, for us as we long to engage in a world, as we seek to be encouraged by the gospel, to be fruitful Christians in a world that hates God. And so I'd love to hear your reasons on why Christianity makes sense and why you should be a Christian or why you are a Christian. And so let me know in the comments below. Make sure you like this video. Make sure you share it with those who are questioning Christianity and whether or not it makes sense of the world that we live in.